Dr. Josef, what do you think is the biggest lie people are told about anxiety and depression?
I think that it's a chemical imbalance. You know, so many things cause anxiety and depression, but most people from the messaging that they'll hear, in the news or even from their doctors will walk away thinking that this is mostly a genetic problem, and that there's not much you could do about it. And that taking medications is often the most sensible thing to do to fix this medical problem.
And what do you think that people should look at instead when they're feeling anxious or depressed?
So I think it's so personalized, but a lot of the things are really intuitive. I think before we got all of this stuff, from the media and doctors and different people who had an agenda to kind of craft that idea that anxiety and depression was chemical. A lot of it is really intuitive. Like I think the major ones are relationships for a big part, like loneliness, social isolation, things like getting a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or being in a mutually satisfying relationship. Another massive thing is just there's a huge lack of purpose in the jobs that people do. I think the way we teach people how to find careers is really off, and many people end up doing things that they're not suited to and that don't energize them, and they end up getting trapped. Um, and I think also obvious reasons are things like financial issues as well, and then something that's really overlooked are health issues, and underneath health issues, a whole bunch of things play a part there. We're designed to be physically active. We feel better when we're physically active. We're not designed to be eating, processed foods. I think 60% of our calories in the US come from processed foods, and we don't sleep well. We're looking at our screens all the time. We're suppressing our melatonin, and I think a lot of us are chronically underslept. And man, there's so much low hanging fruit out there that will do so much more for someone's anxiety and depression in the long run, than taking a pill.
So when you say the chemical imbalance thing, are you saying that you don't think like neurotransmitters are impacted at all?
So, no, definitely neurotransmitters play a role in how we feel. Um, when I say the chemical imbalance thing, usually what I'm actually talking about is that there is a genetic problem that's wrong with your brain that's making you depressed. And then and if there was like a pie that you were looking at, that it would be like 80% of the pie is this brain disease that you have, which is genetic and you can't do anything about. And maybe you can do some of these other things, but really it's mostly genetic. And a bit of nuance is needed here, because clearly if you look around the place, some of us are different. Some of us come out more neurotic, more wired, more high strung than other people. Some of us are worrywarts. And it is true that if you have a more anxious temperament, you're more likely to become depressed. Um, but that is not your destiny. And so, yes, you need to say, yeah, some people can be more anxious or more depressed by their temperament. Everyone is a little bit different, but that's not the biggest aspect of the story, because you can have someone who's a worrywart or neurotic, and if they have all of those other things sorted out in their life, they're not isolated, they're in a good relationship, they like what they're doing, and they're physically healthy, that person's going to function just fine. And while I do think it's possible, like, yes, there may be someone out there, they've done all these things and their health is in order and their life is in order and they're still anxious. Man, that's like a 1 in 1,000 person, because I hardly ever see people where I'm like, I have no idea why you're anxious and depressed. And the only reason I can think of is that, there's something wrong, genetically. And people go and see their doctors these days. They see them with 5 to 10 minutes of FaceTime, usually family doctors. They spend hardly any time trying to understand the person and the issues going on in their life and their health. And they just, say, oh, well, you're depressed because, you've got 5 out of 9 symptoms in the DSM, and don't worry, we've got this safe and effective treatment from the FDA. Let's put you on some Paxil. See you in a couple months. And they haven't tried to help them with any of their root causes at all. They've just essentially, got them on a drug to paper over the symptoms. And it's also a drug that just kind of wears off over time and isn't really a sustainable long-term solution.
I had someone on recently, Dr. Judith Joseph. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she wrote a book about high functioning depression. And we were talking about how people seem to be able to do everything right. They're succeeding in their career, they have a great relationship, they are fit, and yet they just still feel kind of lost. And what she was saying is essentially it comes down to like unresolved trauma at the root of that, where somebody is just addicted to continuing to push and push and push. And then as a result, they're winding up depressed because they feel like they're not doing enough. Do you think that if someone is doing everything right, like checking all the boxes you just mentioned, and they're still finding themselves depressed, do you think they need to take a deeper look into something like childhood trauma?
I think it makes a lot of sense because, and I like the example that you brought up because I mean you can have some people who say, let's say they had parents who were, um, I don't know, that didn't give them any love unless they were really achieving, or they grew up with a massive chip on their shoulder and they never felt like they were good enough or worthy. This is a person that might chase that by always wanting to achieve in their career, and they kind of push everything else to the side and they really grind themselves into the dirt. They don't sleep, they don't look after themselves, they don't look after their health. And yeah, you can see people. I mean, those are the types of like narratives that people tell themselves, which come from things like childhood trauma that can really burn people out. Because when I hear high functioning depression, I think someone who's like pretty burnt out, but they just keep on grinding. Because if they don't stop grinding, they just feel like a terrible person.
And do you think that if someone is continuing to grind it out and but they still feel empty, I mean, do you think like the fix for that is to go to like a licensed therapist and do some work on yourself to figure out like where all these thought patterns come from?
I think you need to disconnect from the busyness, like because um, for these like crazy overachievers that are always doing stuff, I mean, they almost never have any time to kind of stop and be with themselves and listen, because you have to. I mean, this may sound simple, but I think this is the answer. You have to ask yourself, like, what is missing? Why aren't I happy? Where is this yearning coming from? Is it a relationship thing? Do I really actually care about what I'm doing? Like, am I a high achiever and I'm doing like a banking job, but I don't actually feel connected to others? I don't actually feel like I'm helping people, because that's a big desire that a lot of people have. They want to do something they genuinely believe is helpful, and so I think you need space to let those thoughts come in. And I think, yeah, seeing a therapist, maybe someone who specializes in like existential work, where it's like, meaning and purpose. And I think you can put that on steroids if you see someone like that, and then you do some psychedelics, which really allow you to kind of get a new perspective on something and sort of shock you out of that. And that can be powerful as well.
I know you're like big, against kind of everyone being prescribed like an antidepressant as soon as they think they're depressed. Um, from my perspective and my experience as somebody who's been on them or had been on them, I've been on them in a while, like off and on for years when I was younger. What I found personally is I was somebody who struggled with like chronic anxiety and panic, even like when at times everything looked good on paper. I was super successful in my career, I was fit, all these things. And what the medication did for me is it like stopped the anxiety like in its tracks so that I could function like normally for a period of time, which I think is like the end goal I would hope for people being prescribed these, is to like give you some sort of immediate relief. However, I did find that over time, you develop tolerance and they're not as effective. And I had to like do the work in other areas of my life. And I found that what really helped me was going to therapy, and understanding why I was continuing to force myself to be stressed, even when I didn't need to be stressed, and understanding the relationship between how I grew up and the way I was behaving in my adult life just clicked for me, because I was like, oh, I'm not broken. This makes sense. I'm a logical guy. A plus B equals C. But I look back at my life and I don't know, I think my life would have been worse in the near term if I hadn't taken the SSRI to help alleviate that like panic, because I was at a point where it was like hard for me to like go certain places without like kind of panicking a little bit. So I definitely see both sides. I'm also like, I'm also the person that will say, like, I think that lifestyle plays a massive role in mental health, which I know you're pretty passionate about as well. And that, like, before you go see somebody, just make sure that, like, take some inventory and look at like the role that your habits and behaviors are playing and how it impacts like your day to day. Like, if you have crap relationships, you're probably going to have crappy mental health. If you have crappy like lifestyle habits, your mental health is going to suffer as well.
Yeah. And Doug, with the do you think that when you started antidepressants, because I know you mentioned later on in your story that you ended up seeing a therapist, um, how do you think things would have gone if when you went to see that family doctor or the psychiatrist, they had said, "Hey, Doug, let's get you into therapy for a couple of months and just see how things go before we start this." Do you think that would have been bad, a worse choice for you, having experienced what happened on the medications and then seeing what's happened with therapy?
I don't know if it would have changed much. And I say that just because I remember like vividly like what I was like back then. I wanted the symptoms to go away like immediately. And I had been in and out of like talk therapy. And I knew that, like, they tell you, to focus on the breath and to focus on this. But I think, sometimes when you're just in the thick of panic, like you just want to be able to function like day to day. And so, I think medication for me, do I think it was a net negative? I mean, I can't say that. I think that it just played the role that it did at that time. Coming off of them was brutal for me. Um, but I can definitely like just relate to the people that are like, I just want to feel better right now. And I just want like whatever's going on in my mind to go away. I mean, I also think that like the theme of our conversation around like focusing on your lifestyle and your habits and behaviors and taking some level of responsibility, I think that was most of the work for me. Was I was afraid of looking at those darker parts of myself and looking at my role in certain things and why, I thought certain things or felt certain things, and those things were tough to face, you know, but I just think it was just a multifaceted approach for me that has helped me now, be somebody that thrives in life and that can manage my mental health in a way that I think is very effective.
Now, so your experience is a very common experience. There are these two major narratives that you'll hear about these medications. You have one camp of people, and they say, "These medications saved my life. They pulled me out of a dark place. They put me back on the right track, and they're great." And then you have another camp of people who are just like, avoid these at all costs. Um, and these two narratives can exist because inherently there's nothing wrong with the drugs. The problem with the medications is what we tell people about them. Um, so to get on a medication, in a period of intense anxiety, it's going to be emotionally constricting. It's going to make sure that those anxious thoughts don't rule your life, and you'll actually have space to breathe. It can stop the panic and allow you to maybe take inventory of some other things going on in your life and just give you a raft to sort of breathe on. And that's great. And there's no shame in that. The issue with the meds is if someone isn't like you and they don't have this kind of drive to understand their life, they can end up just grabbing onto the med, and that's like, hey, that's the solution for my problem. This is the chemical imbalance, especially if they're told a bad narrative about it. And then that drug effect just wears off over time, and they need a higher and higher dose and so on and so forth. I mean, the use for these medications really is like you did, as a life raft while someone figures out the other things going on in their life. And ideally, then they come off as soon as they don't need them. And that's kind of the best case scenario for it.
Well, and I totally agree with you on that. I think the problem becomes, this is where I have a hard time with people who quote unquote identify as an addict, where I think there is a certain part of the population, a certain percentage of people that like they just wake up and they crave like bottle of vodka. Or they were like, you hear the story, they were like 13 and they saw like their first like bottle of wine and then they drank 5 bottles or something. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get my point. And then I think the problem becomes anyone who gets addicted to a substance then is convinced that they're an addict for the rest of their lives. When really, it's, in my opinion, there's so much nuance that goes into that conversation. And the term addict is not very positive. So then you end up, kind of limiting yourself to what you can achieve because there's an element of brokenness that you kind of, some people accept, right? And, I think that can be the same with people who are just convinced that their mental health is going to be their identity for the rest of their lives. I think we all go through times in life where we're mentally off, we're going through it, and we have to find ways to navigate that. I think in certain situations, and such, being on a
I
medication
think,
to help, be the life raft, I think is very important. I think sometimes people need to be like, is me, do I need to look at my sleep? Do I need to look at my stress? Do I need to look at like what I'm eating, exercise, who I'm spending time with? Because, if you're like in an abusive relationship, I mean, the odds of you being depressed are very high. And it's like, is it because there's something wrong with your brain, or is it because you're in an abusive relationship? Right. And I think everybody kind of knows that answer. So I just think it's a multifaceted conversation. I don't think there's one size that fits all.
yeah, that's a very nuanced point, Doug, and it's not something that I've thought about before. But yeah, you've given me a lot to think about because I mean, all of these labels that we give people, sex addict, pornography addict, gambling addict, depressed. They, it's almost like you have a medical condition, and we're going to alleviate responsibility for it because there's something wrong with you. And I get that, and I get the positive part of it that it reduces stigma and it says, hey, don't don't worry about coming forward and seeking help because this might not all be your fault. But the other side of that is it's misleading because I think a lot of these things have similar roots. When I think about sex addiction and people who are addicted to pornography, a lot of that is stress relief from their life. Gambling is a way to escape anxiety disorders, and going to medications can be a way to escape problems that are real, and same as abusing drugs. And when you look at these people, um, you're going to see that they have a lot of the same problems. They have relationship problems, they have health problems, they have childhood trauma. They're doing work that they don't really believe in. Their sleep is terrible, and if you can get these people feeling better from a health perspective through lifestyle interventions, and then you can address those psychological wounds, or maybe give them some coaching in terms of finding a better work or more fulfilling relationships, the addictions, they drop away because that person isn't feeling terrible every single day, needing to escape those awful feelings in their body.
Yeah, I had Dr. K on the podcast. I think it's been about last year sometime. And we were talking about the problem with like recovering from addiction is you have to give somebody a better offer. Like, what's the better offer for someone who's been like drowning themselves with substances to numb the pain? Like, and it's hard, I think, sometimes to convince someone who's like knee deep in a depressive cycle or an addiction to be like, yeah, just go work out and that'll like give you the same effect of like whatever drugs you're doing, right? Because in my experience, in that person feels so low about themselves. Their life, like you said, typically is falling apart in every other area. And their ability to like problem solve and think logically is completely out the window. And so while I think like, the right answer is what we're talking about, and I firmly believe that. However, as somebody who's been in that position, that answer isn't necessarily the easiest for that person, because they're like, help me, help show me how this makes sense to me. Like, you're telling me I can get rid of this like highly abusive substance that has been solving all my problems for the last 20 years, and I'm just going to go outside and take a walk, and that's going to do the same thing for me. I think that if we can somehow, and this is like the $1 million question, right? Like, how can we bridge that gap? How can we help people get rid of, I'm talking about like illegal substances, people who are hooked on like things like heroin, coke, like all these things, and then allow them to make these small steps in place of that to rebuild their brain, and to help them like find better ways to cope and navigate with stress. I mean, if I had the answer to that, I would have to quit the podcast and I'd be a bazillionaire, but I just don't. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the issue is that I think there is an answer to that, and it's not scalable at all, and it's very hard and time intensive, and that's just the reality of fixing massive problems. Uh, it's not easy to like let's say one of like the core wounds of someone is that they can't get a girlfriend, and they're isolated and they feel like um, just lonely all the time and miserable. It's you can't just say, hey, go out and meet people. You have to really understand where that's coming from. What are you afraid of? What do we have to develop in your social skills so you're able to go out there and not be afraid. How can I convince someone to expose themselves to interactions with people so they can see, hey, I didn't die. Same with finding a fulfilling career. Oh my god, I hate what I'm doing and I really want to do this. You have to I mean, these are massively complicated, huge problems for each person who's going to be bringing all of their trauma and pre-existing beliefs into it, and you need to sit with that person and break it down, and then take these massive problems and break them into little steps that feel digestible for them, and so they can say, oh, it's actually possible. This doesn't feel like this completely overwhelming thing. Because I'm with you. If someone is, having serious problems and just like, hey, try a paleo diet and walk. It's like, are you kidding me? My life is in shambles, and they're right. You have to look at them and just say, you have really big problems here, and we need to break them into small digestible pieces. And you probably need reassurance and support and community, so we can make this seem like it's realistic for you. Um, it's just so time intensive.
I'm seeing like an increase in self-diagnosis of mental health conditions. Like, everybody now seems to have anxiety, everybody has ADHD, everybody's depressed. And again, not to say that people aren't, because obviously they are. We're in a mental health crisis right now. I just think there's a certain level of danger that comes with either self-diagnosing yourself or being wrongfully diagnosed, where you have a bad few days, you go see somebody, and they're like, oh, you're clinically depressed. Like, how can people, without trashing doctors, I don't want this to be an episode just about trashing mental health professionals, like, without trashing doctors, how can people get better at not falling into the trap of being wrongfully diagnosed?
Yeah, so let's break it up into two parts. I want to talk about health, and then I want to talk about life problems. And so when it comes to health, I would just tell someone to go and see a functional medicine doctor, not a general practitioner. Go and see someone who actually is interested in root cause medicine. They'll talk to you about your diet and your gut health, and you know why you can't sleep, and you're covered with rashes, and you're sensitive to food, and you have like diarrhea, because there's all of these things that you can just fix just with diet and targeted supplementation for like deficiencies. So functional medicine doctor is where you should go for health. They'll also talk to you about exercise and movement and sleep hygiene, and so I think that's a great place. The part of it that becomes a bit more complicated is life, because I think with some therapists, they're trained to just do manualized therapy, and they're just like, I do CBT, and I'm not really going to fully understand all of the issues going on in your life, and I'm just going to walk you through this protocol. I mean, you will have to probably drive some of it. You need to take counsel with yourself and say, and usually it's just a couple things. It's like relationships or work issues. And yes, trauma is a part of it, but trauma often shows up in relationship and work. And so you need to kind of decide, is this like a loneliness thing? Or am I in unsatisfying or abusive relationships? If that's the case, I need to go and see someone who's specialized in that area to really diagnose the issue. If it's a work issue, go and find a career coach. Um, so you really just, what you don't want to do is see someone for 5 to 10 minutes and say, "Oh, they know what's going on with me." It's you're so much more complicated than that, and you need to make sure that you're seeing the right professional. Because once you get the right diagnosis and they say, "Hey, this is what's going on. You got some health things here that you need to figure out. You got some childhood trauma things that are leading to problems in relationships and problems with work and how you're looking after yourself." If you get the correct diagnosis, the problems become a lot faster to fix.
But don't you think that in that time, like medication could be an effective tool for short term to help them get acclimated and improve their day to day life while they're making this transition?
It depends. So it can be if someone is at the point where they're so paralyzed by their symptoms, it just feels insurmountable to do those efforts. In which case, use the medications. It's kind of like it greases the wheels. It allows you to get involved in that. The only issue is really when people start to say, these problems are too big for me, they're too hard, they're too overwhelming, I'm just going to rely on the medications. And I think there's a strong temptation to do that because it's nice. Who doesn't want a single solution for all of the messy problems in their life? Oh, I just take this pill every day, and all the stress I'm feeling about my relationship problems and my work dissatisfaction just goes away. I don't have to address these massively complicated issues.
And is that why you think that in many cases antidepressants can make things worse for some people? Is because they latch onto them and they don't do the work in other areas of their life that actually can help them get better too?
Yeah, uh, it is that, and so yes, there's an opportunity cost when you're taking them without improving your life, and you're taking them under the belief that they're fixing just like a genetic problem in your brain. But the other issue is they just don't work long term. There's very obvious tolerance problems. People get on them, and within, like, I don't know, 2 to 5 years, they're usually on the max dose. The drug is usually the most effective before they're maxed out on the dose. So eventually they can't go any higher. The effect wanes. They're feeling it maybe 10%, or some people even say things like, "I'm not even feeling it anymore." And so they're getting hit with side effects. It's hardly effective anymore. And then, especially with things like the SSRIs, they just make people feel worse in the long run. People will start to complain of fatigue, brain fog, and low motivation, because the brain is not designed to be bombarded with chemicals, for years and decades at a time. And so they're just not sustainable solutions for people. Yes, there's always, I have to say this, there's always this use case scenario for the person where everything, they've done everything that they can and they're still feeling terrible. By all means, you should use what tools we have available. But that's like, one out of like 100 or 1 out of 1,000. You talk to enough of these people, you realize they all have real problems in their life that would actually deserve, um, root cause treatments.
If you were to narrow it down to one thing that you think is at the root of people's problems, what do you think it is?
It's relationships and work and health. Well, I mean, it's three things. I know you just mentioned one, but that's the way I always look at it. I think it's health, your physical health, your relationships, and your work. If you can get those things in order, the vast majority of people will feel good.
So, what would you say would be a good, simple first step for someone who's feeling lost or stuck right now and they want to just kind of begin to understand how they can take the steps to feel better?
I'd always start with physical health because once you actually feel better, a lot of the other problems become easier to solve, like, whether it's relationships or work. And so, um, I think, um, easy things for people to try is to just move your body every day. Try and do at least 5,000 steps a day as a start, but ideally you're doing some zone 2 cardio, which is when your heart rate's kind of around like 100 to 130. And so, you're burning off some of that energy. It'll help you sleep better. You'll feel better. So moving your body, um, eating non-processed foods. This is a very complicated area where it's unclear to know exactly what is playing a role. But I would recommend moving away from processed foods, seed oils, and gluten. Like, if you were going to try just some big sweeping changes, you end up just eating things like steak and fish and and vegetables. Um, just see how it feels. I mean, for some people the effect is dramatic. For others it isn't. But putting actual real foods in your body, is great. I think trying a paleo style diet usually gets people feeling better. And then when it comes to sleep, this will sound silly, but it's just like, prioritize sleep in your life. Lower the temperature. Put your thermostat between 68 and 71. Find the right temperature for you. Sleep cool. Eliminate screens before you go to bed because they suppress your melatonin. And just see how you feel with improved sleep, some physical activity, and good food. Um, I think, because, I mean, I think people can relate to this. Like, if you are actually sleeping better and you wake up, things seem less stressful. You seem, complicated issues start to become less complicated. So I would start with health first, and then go and address the life issues.
We're in this loneliness crisis right now where people are just feeling more lonely than ever. How can people begin to untangle that to improve their mental health? This episode is brought to you by Live On Labs. If you are someone who is constantly stressed, feeling depleted, and exhausted, I have some exciting news. My friends at Live On Labs have an incredible deal I can offer you. When you buy any product at full price, you get a free carton of their highly popular B complex product, which I take every day. Taking a B complex supplement can also help support things like a healthy metabolism, increased energy, blood sugar balance, and learning. Vitamin B supplements can help replenish nutrients depleted from stress. Live On Labs puts years of research into each product, which is why I stand behind them. Using liposome encapsulation technology, these products promote elite absorption so the supplements get into your cells and give you the best benefits that you're looking for. Right now, you can get a free carton of Lipospheric B Complex Plus, which is a $56 value, with any full price purchase from liveonlabs.com. This supplement has the B vitamins and minerals that you need to help turn food into sustained natural energy throughout the day. Just add B Complex Plus and any other full price supplement to your cart and enter code BOPES24 at checkout to get this amazing deal. Now back to the show.
I'm trying to figure out which way to get at this. I'm going to go at this, maybe for younger people now. So I think one of the issues with, so much, social media and Netflix and things like that, it can make it really, like, we never really have to deal with being bored anymore. And if you can, remove the apps from your phone, or find some app to kind of block them when you're just, moving through your life, you will be bored, and you'll actually interact more with the people around you. And so it's good to be bored. And that can drive you towards approaching people and talking more. I also think, doing work that you actually like is really important for being connected, especially if you're a man, and you're spending, like, well, for a man and a woman, if you spend a lot of time at work, if you're doing things that you actually like, you're going to come across people who have similar values to you, and it'll be a lot easier to connect with them. That's what I've found personally in my life. And it's just, socialization is like a muscle that you have to work out. Um, I would try and push yourself into just interactions with people to build those connections. It's a muscle that has become incredibly atrophied where people stay at home and they just communicate online. Wave at someone across the room in the bar. Just be like, hey, you look nice. I wanted to come and meet you. Even if that person totally rejects you and turns away, you've learned that you're not going to die, and it's okay. And you may meet some people who are nice. I mean, you can do that in a library. You can do that anyway. But to just kind of push yourself into being, social. It's a skill set, just like anything else. I know that was kind of a random jumble of thoughts. I haven't been asked that question in a while, but those are some of my thoughts. I mean, Doug, what do you think? I know you do some of this, coaching, and you're helping people. What's your perspective on loneliness and social isolation?
I mean, I think technology, it's just like anything. There's a lot of amazing things that come with it, and there's a lot of negative things, right? I think in many ways, technology has replaced in-person relationships for certain people, and you're just like, you're sending like a text, or you're sending a snap, or you're sending this, or you're sending that, and it's like the way we communicate is just so different. I mean, and I just think from the way I understand the brain, like it's just like changing the brain, because now it's just like more instant gratification. You have to, like, you're waiting for a response like right away. If you want food, you know, take out like the hunter gatherer conversation, because I wasn't alive back then, so I can't relate. But the fact of the matter is, I used to, when I was younger, you'd have to, like, save some money or work, get a paycheck, go to the grocery store, come up with, write down a list on a piece of paper, hope you remember the list, and then figure out what you needed at the store, come home, and that was it. Now, I mean, you can put, your groceries, you can order groceries through an app, you can order fast food through an app, you can put things on a credit card. I think now you can maybe even finance some of this stuff. So it's just like the instant gratification trap is way more addictive now than ever. And I think, coming back to the conversation about isolation, I just think it gets in the way of people's ability to be intentional and focused when they're in person to person, when they're in person, because no matter what, that's a skill that is way, as long as we're human beings, you're going to have to manage and master interpersonal relationships if you want to succeed in life, no doubt. I think that when people don't do the work on themselves, they end up finding themselves in relationships they don't want to be in. They end up finding themselves wanting to fit in, to look cool, or to like get attention. And they end up finding themselves miserable spending time with people, even though they have people around them. And I think that's a conversation that doesn't get talked about as much as like the typical loneliness where you're like in your room with no friends, right? Is that people are just unaligned in life. They don't feel connected to themselves. They don't feel connected to the people in their life. And so I think the hack to that, is just doing the work on yourself, where you're understanding who you are, your values, your morals, what you want in life, your goals, and then kind of orchestrating the people around you to kind of mimic that in some way, while also obviously allowing for like people who disagree with you, like the people that I have in my life. I mean, I don't agree with them on everything, but there's some level of common themes, that, I love being around people who are independent thinking. Independent thinkers are critical thinkers. Like, I don't want someone that just agrees with everything I say. And I don't want to be, it's hard to be around people that don't challenge your thinking, or they don't like think for themselves. I mean, and that can have many flavors to it, right? And so the way to address loneliness is to address the relationship with yourself. And then once you do that, I mean, there's a good chance you're going to end up having pretty good relationships in your life. And obviously there's the people that still like just can't get out of their own way and they feel stuck. But that I don't think is as common as the people that just need to work on themselves, and that'll in turn improve the relationships they have.
For men, I feel like relationships is almost like if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as you kind of go, it's more complex as you go up. I think at the bottom, it's just you have to physically be healthy first, and then I think for men, and you might not like this, but this is just the reality. a lot of the way society looks at men is, what value do you bring to the table? Are you someone that has your life together? Are you, someone, you know who you are, you know what you stand for? Usually that goes along with having some direction in your career, which is the main way that you help others and people in the world. And as you kind of go up and you have those things in order, you will naturally be around better people. And it's not just, you can't just have your life in order and say, oh, I make this much money and I have a great career. Then you need to actually bring in the other skill, which is like actually putting yourself out there and meeting people. Because it's not just being around people, it's being around people that you actually like. It's not just getting a girlfriend, it's getting a girlfriend that's a good girlfriend. And the only way you kind of do that is by being brave enough to kind of put yourself out into those situations and meet people. And eventually you're like, I like this, I don't like that, and you have these experiences. And you can do that in your romantic life, and you can do that in just your platonic friendships. But you will, if you just, grab onto the first set of friends or the people from high school or the first girl that you meet, there's a good chance that might not be the right fit for you. And the only way you're going to find the right fit for you is if you're actually out there interacting with a lot of people. There's no shortcut to this. Yes, I know some people get lucky, but most of us don't. You really need to go out there and have those experiences. And a good partner in a friendship group is one of the most important things in your life, and it's worth years of effort to really kind of figure these things out.
Right. And I think if you're not fully confident with yourself, or you're not being validated in your own life, you will search for quantity and not quality when it comes to friendships, because you'll need more like attention, and more kind of validation from a bunch of different people, instead of like using your friendships as an extension of what you're already doing. And I've often said that I think that people need to spend time with people who have common futures and not common pasts. Like you see so many times where it's like people are in their 40s still talking to people that like they partied in college with, and that's the only like real through line, is that they partied together in college. It's not like they, then kind of grew up and then like they have kids. This other family has kids and now their kids are friends. It's not. It's more like, no, we just like were in a fraternity together like 20 years ago, and like that was their friendship, and it's like meaningless. And it's not to say that you can't be friends with people you went to college with. It's more like, what's the depth of those relationships? Is it a relationship because you just feel like guilty, like not cutting them off, or is it a relationship you feel like, you know, you have to have them around for some reason, or whatever it is? Like, just think you have to ask yourself like hard questions. I think I've said this on the show a few times, and Jordan Peterson, he says like, if your life isn't where you want it to be, start telling yourself the truth, or something. It's something like that. And radical honesty, I think, goes a long way. And I think you have to be able to have those hard conversations with yourself, because that will ultimately move the needle. Like what I'm sharing right now isn't to shame or judge anyone. It's more like, I've lived through this. I mean, I spent years trying to be friends with everyone. I spent years trying to like keep people in my life just for the sake of like not, feeling bad or whatever. And it was just such a waste of time and energy, and just the amount of work it took emotionally. It was like I could have been spending my time doing so many other things.
I mean, for me, I've experienced just that as well. And I've done jobs which I really didn't enjoy. Well, they were interesting, but my heart really wasn't in them. And I'd be like, I'm lonely, and I'd be thinking about people that I used to go out and party with and have a good time with from in the past, but we really didn't have anything in common. And a lot of that goes away. And this is why this is why not settling with work and trying to find something that you really believe in can be important, because I feel like male friendships are formed by like shared experiences, right? And you get to a certain point in your life when you have kids, and you guys aren't going out on a wild night and laughing about things that happened. A lot of the shared experience is like actually things that you're working on together. And so I really like when you work in person with people, who are aligned with what you're doing and your mission, and you like that, you will have a lot of these spontaneous, enjoyable moments where you kind of laugh and you're just like, what happened with this client? That's so funny. And that's kind of what we're designed to do. I mean, we used to get up in the morning and go out with our tribe and go and get food. We had a mission. It was we were going out and hunting together, and you were just kind of bonded in that way. But if you're just working at some bank or some engineering firm because your parents told you to do that, or just something that you don't really care about, you're not going to have this mission that you share with people, where you form these connections through this shared experience. And when you do, the relationships become a lot less forced. I mean, they just become natural because you're sharing things together. So I think in-person work with people that you actually like. I mean, this could be on a construction site. If you're just like, this is what I love to do, like you will just feel better, and it will be easier to be connected.
What questions do you think doctors should ask people about mental suffering when someone's going into their office? They can better understand what that person's actually going through.
Tell me about your relationships. Tell me about your work. And tell me about your physical health. How many hours are you sleeping? What's your diet like? Do you move your body every day? Um, Now the thing is, I don't think a lot of doctors should be really veering into mental health unless they actually have the time to do it. Because a lot of these family medicine doctors who are prescribing these meds, I mean, they're spending like 5 to 10 minutes of FaceTime with people. And that's nowhere near enough time to do an audit of someone's relationships, their work, and their health. And so I think that you should go to someone that actually has the time to understand you, and they should be asking these questions. Because if there is some low hanging fruit, is that if there is something that they can do before giving you a drug, man, you deserve the opportunity to try some of those things.
I look at my own experience, and I've noticed that when doctors ask me, in the past, about stuff like that, I'm just like, oh, it's good. It's good. And then, like, just because you're trying to, like, just get in and out of there, you're not trying to, like, have them pry into. So I do think there's a level of responsibility for the person going in there, to be honest, because, like, I mean, plenty of people just go in there and they just BS their way through these appointments. Just like people go to therapy and they're not honest with themselves, you know, it's like hard for the therapist to actually help that person, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and we would want the doctors to be like, hang on a second, tell me more, or the therapist to say, I hardly meet, and why are you here? If everything is okay, you want them to call you out on it. But there's a bad incentive in healthcare these days, where the healthcare providers, they're not incentivized to actually fix your problems and get you well. They are incentivized to kind of just move you through. With PCPs, it's see 4 patients in an hour. So if someone says, "Hey, I saw this ad on TV, and Trintellix, it's this new antidepressant. I really want to try it." Unfortunately, some doctors will say, well, give the patient what they want. It'll make for a more efficient encounter, um, and they'll go through. And so you're right. There needs to be responsibility on the side of the patients, but unfortunately, we've got some pretty bad incentives in medicine that result in doctors not really pulling people up and just say, hey, listen, man, this is a big decision to take one of these things. I want to make sure that you really have thought this through. Let's get you back in here tomorrow. We'll meet for a longer amount of time and really give this decision the time that it deserves. People aren't having those experiences. They're just kind of just cycling through.
What do you think from a larger scale is at the root of like this mental health epidemic we're currently in? Is it relationships? Is it loneliness? Is it social media? Like, what do you think it is?
I think it's a whole bunch of bad ideas that have been that I think it's social media and a whole bunch of bad ideas. Like, so for instance, I think, I mean, some of these, like, I, I've dealt with a lot of loneliness. My wife has dealt with a lot of loneliness because we move all the time. And so, in a society where, you know, where people are constantly moving towns and cities and all over the place, you don't really have roots like you used to. And so you have to build up that community again. I think social media is damaging in a couple ways. I think it atrophies like real one-on-one social skills that allow people to connect. I also think it doesn't, like everyone's so addicted to this like quick fix. You always see this stuff online. Here are the quick steps to get a six pack or get a girlfriend or something like that. There's been a loss of, I think, just real sensible normal advice for figuring these things out, where someone takes the time to guide folks. I think the whole idea of going to college in many ways has become, you know unhelpful for so many people because they end up getting pushed into degrees. I know a lot of young people get pushed into degrees that they really don't energize them. They say, oh, this is a safe degree. This is, I'll always have a job. But then they hate it and they end up, taking ADHD meds or antidepressants so they can get through it. And you're never going to be successful doing work that doesn't energize you. And so the whole way we even guide, I don't think we really guide people that well in terms of finding work. Um, and then, there's also the medical establishment. We've pretty much let pharmaceutical companies control the narrative about mental health, and we've been completely happy with them putting out this message that mental health is biological and take the drugs. When I think the psychologists and the doctors should be standing up and just saying, "Hey, listen, there's a lot of other ways that we need to be helping these patients first, because these drugs aren't great long-term solutions." And so things are falling apart in multiple different areas, and I think and because of that, I actually don't think you can rely too heavily on the experts or the professionals out there. I think you actually have to be quite involved in your own mental health healing, you know, given what the professional landscape looks like.
I think people are also, they just don't know how to deal with discomfort. And as a result, they end up looking for things like drugs and alcohol to solve their current mental state. When also, I think if you can just have a basic level of understanding that, like, hey, like if you lose your job, I mean, you're going to get stressed, you're going to be anxious. Like it's a normal, like physiological function of their body to protect you. And that's normal. Like there's nothing wrong with that. I think if people can just understand more about how the human body works, your survival system, the nervous system, I think people would have less shame and guilt and stigma around the way that they feel on a day-to-day basis.
And I think, a lot of these things are so much harder now with the isolation. I mean, dealing with the loss of the job, but you don't have your family, you don't have your community around you. You're living in a new place. Your wife is working full time. You have a kid. You guys are stressed. You're strapped for time. Like, I feel like a lot of the things that help us deal with these awful things that happen to us have kind of just fallen away.
There's a lot of people that feel hopeless right now. Like, what do you think somebody can do when they feel like they've tried everything and yet nothing's working?
Well, the question I would ask yourself is, do I feel like, do you really understand your problems? And I would challenge you if you say yes, because I think we're really not that intuitive when it comes to things. So many people are like, well, the drugs help me, or these cigarettes help me feel relaxed, or what's the deal with a couple of drinks, or the Xanax. It kind of just there's like a million ways. We lie to ourselves. If you're feeling lost, I would go and see a professional, like a good one, to get a proper diagnosis of your issues. And if the professional says, hey, you're totally fine, then you might say, then you can be like, well, I'm doing everything. But find out what's going on. I mean, I always think the lowest hanging fruit is just to be physically healthy. Put the right food in your body, move, and get enough sleep. Everything becomes clearer after you do that.
Right. And I think that people also need to be mindful when they go to like a functional medicine person. I mean, I'm all for like the holistic approach when it comes to health. I mean, because they shill supplements. You know what I mean? And I've seen in my career as a trainer, I've just seen so many people spend thousands of dollars on unnecessary supplements because their quote unquote functional doctor, created some diagnosis that they have and they're now having to flush out their system. And I just think there's a lot of BS that exists within that space as well. And oftentimes I've shown people like what supplements actually cost and the markup. And, it's like 100% markup on these supplements that these quote unquote doctors, are selling. And there's like these made up conditions just to give you a supplement to treat that instead of like being like, all right, why don't you just like exercise more, reduce your stress, improve your relationships, like do these simple things that you and I have kind of been talking about and then come back. But I can't tell you how many people I've seen that go to these doctors, they do a comprehensive lab panel, they make up some condition they may or may not have, only to put them on like fifty supplements they have to order where they're like making bank on the supplements. They're making more money off the supplements than they are seeing the patient. So I think both sides, you could argue there could be some level of like people being, disingenuous.
Yeah, I mean it's a landfill, a field of mines out there, and you're totally right. I think you have to put a premium on the things that just make sense. And the things that make sense are moving your bodies, eating clean, and getting enough sleep. Before you go chasing down, some diagnosis that you've never heard about before, like do those things. But I mean, there are legit medical issues in there, and if you and that might be the level two. After you've worked on your diet and exercise and sleep, you might want to see if you have sleep apnea, or you might want to see if you've got some kind of anemia going on, or you may need the support to do a full elimination diet. For instance, where it's like, okay, well, let's remove some soy, let's remove some gluten, let's remove these, the top 10 allergens, and actually systematically have a look at how you feel, because that might be playing a role. But you're totally right. I think there are some shills out there who just say, oh, everything is because you're deficient on this vitamin or that vitamin, without looking at the broader picture of what's going on in your life. And I mean, this is kind of like a very bleak message. I mean, it's like when you work with all of these professionals, you kind of have to already have a sort of lay of the land to know that you're not being, sold a fake bill of goods, and you're just taking all these supplements for no reason.
Right. And I think, and I want, I'm not against supplements. Obviously I promote supplements on the podcast, big fan of them for different uses and different ways. However, what I'm not a fan of is like when people, go to these doctors, these functional medicine doctors, and they come back with this like receipt, of spending thousands of dollars of supplements they've never heard of. And then, they're also not addressing other areas of their life. Like, I always tell people like gut health issues, for instance, like when people come to me, they're like, I have like, issues with my gut and sleep. They're like, oh, these supplements I was told are going to fix that. Well, it's like, well, unless I know what your home life's like, so unless you fix that, like nothing's going to change. I hate to break it to you. You know what I mean? So I think that people do need to like address these things from a root cause themselves and then use these other things as an add-on to what they're already doing.
Yeah, I mean, the quick sort of cheat sheet that I would give you on knowing whether something is kind of would be, I believe in laboratory testing. Like, don't just take like fixed deficiencies. I mean, if you're really low in vitamin D or B12, you know, fix it. Get the lab done again. Once you're back in, once you're not deficient anymore, just stop it. But if people are just kind of like giving them to you, without any real measurement or any real goal, um, to me that doesn't make a lot of sense. Now the other issue is there's a whole bunch of supplements out there that are essentially just psychiatric drugs, dressed up as natural remedies. Like I think about stuff like ashwagandha. This has a blunting and calming effect, same as St. John's wort. It's no different than taking a psychiatric drug. You're essentially masking symptoms with a supplement. Whereas the real question is, why do I feel so keyed up and stressed all the time? Um, And so there's a lot of these, I don't know, people call them nutraceuticals or things like that, where you can take high enough doses of botanicals or different things to exert like a pharmacologic effect. I think people should also be wary of that. You're just doing the same thing. You're using a compound to exert a drug effect, and you're probably masking something.
I remember when I was abusing drugs. When I was abusing, OxyContin, at my worst, and I was snorting hundreds of milligrams at my nose. And I remember just finding a way to always rationalize and justify. I'm like, well, I'm not doing heroin. I'm not putting a needle in my arm. But reality, as we know, like it's up there with heroin, just as bad. And I think sometimes people will do that with supplements. They're like, I'm not taking a pharmaceutical drug, so I can rationalize just masking it with this supplement. I think everybody, in some ways, and that we've all done this, find a way to protect our ego and to rationalize certain things and rationalize like masking certain problems instead of doing their real work. It's like everybody finds their flavor of hiding behind certain things. And I think it's not until you peel the onion back and you understand what you're masking and working on that to where you really truly get better. Because again, like if you have a horrible home life, like no probiotic is going to fix your gut health. You know what I mean? If you have a terrible home life, like, taking melatonin or any kind of remedy at night, magnesium isn't going to help your sleep. But if you were to address your home life and get that in order, you could get some level of baseline to actually understand like what's going on, because otherwise you'll never know what the real cause is.
Yeah. And it's so painful to be honest with yourself about these things. I mean, I feel like that's the allure of the medication. It's like you don't have to look at these glaringly, these horrific problems in your life where it's like, oh, I spent 10 years in the wrong career. Oh my God, I'm married to the wrong person. This isn't going in the right direction. I mean, it's so much easier to look at this medication or this supplement as the cure. And it takes some time, and this is not to, I know how hard this stuff is. I mean, but it does take some time and it takes support. And sometimes it takes a professional to kind of work with you to get you to the point where you can feel like I can actually look at this without falling to pieces.
Yeah. Well, and it's a hard conversations to have, right? Because some of these conversations can create much more damage in the short term. I mean, if you're somebody who's married, you got 3 kids, there's like some level of toxicity there. There's abuse, there's like infidelity or something that's like creating an intense, burn in the relationship and in your life. Like getting rid of that is probably going to create more pain in the short term, because now you're going to incur, attorney fees, emotional pain. You're dealing with kids, custody, all these things that you look at it and you're like, well, what's the lesser of two evils right now, right? And obviously, the logical answer is, well, get out of that situation. It'll be better long term. But I think when you're in the situation, sometimes people just panic and they don't know what to do. They feel like they have to stay in a situation like that because they're not going to find, they have their kids.
Yeah. And that decision is certainly not an easy one. And I don't think there's one right decision because there are kids there and they're so individualized. There's never like, this is the right way to deal with that situation.
You went through the traditional psychiatry path. Like, what was the wake up call you had where you decided to like essentially flip flop and change your mind about everything that you had been taught?
Maybe two things. I mean, the first thing was just being in residency and just seeing that it didn't work. I mean, the longer that the people were on the medications for, the higher the dose went. They kept on saying that the drug effect was less and less. And then I would just see so many people on like 3, 4, 5 different medications, and I could just see the trajectory. The drugs weren't making people better. We weren't addressing the root cause issues, and they were just accumulating medications, getting worse. And so the model of just using drugs to help people just seemed flawed um, in a major way. The second awakening I had was when I was working at the FDA, and I got to really see the clinical trial evidence that was supporting long-term use. And I was just like, oh, wow, none of these drugs have been studied longer than a year. We have no idea what they do after a year's duration. All of those things that I was seeing in my residency, the drugs wearing off, some people getting worse, like that's pretty valid because we don't have any clinical trials saying, hey, this works long term. And so that was really disturbing. And then I became a side effect expert. That's what I did for the pharmaceutical industry. And so I got to see, that actually a lot of these drugs, not only do they wear off, they make people worse long term. You get like this low energy kind of brain fog state on the SSRIs, benzodiazepines like Xanax and Klonopin. They make people more anxious. They give them obsessive ruminative thoughts long term. The antipsychotic medications cause cognitive decline, dementia like symptoms, and brain shrinkage. And it's like I would be putting people on these drugs, that wouldn't make people, would wear off over time and make them worse. And I actually realized I was making a lot of people sicker. And then there's the whole withdrawal issue. I was always told that withdrawal was mild and self-limiting, that it would last a couple of weeks when I went through training. But then when I looked into it more, when you yank people off antidepressants and benzos, it can be hell. And there's a small proportion of people that develop brain damage from it, and that can take years to go away. That's what I talk a lot of on my channel. It's a condition called protracted withdrawal. And so it's like you put people on these medications, they don't work long term. Sometimes they even make you worse. And then when you try and take them off, it's horrific. And then for a small group of people, you give them a neurological injury that takes several years to recover from. I mean, that was enough for me to just say, you know what, this is so twisted. And I mean, that's when I started my practice with my wife. She's also a psychiatrist. And we said, we're not going to be a part of this. I'm leaving the pharmaceutical industry. We're just going to help people come off these medications. We're going to teach them non-drug approaches to their mental health because that is not the answer that the majority of people need.
I feel like we're in this time right now where people are just so divided in the health space, in the medical health space. You have the people that are, on one camp, they're like 100% Maha, like, stop taking seed oils and you'll never feel sick again, which I don't necessarily agree with. And you have the other side that's like anything that anybody says that I don't agree with, it's misinformation or whatever. And there's this huge push, I think from the Maha community to like, in over index on health and lifestyle, which, I agree with obviously people taking a deeper look into their health and lifestyle. But I also think, in many cases, they're like focusing on banning like artificial flavors, but they're not banning like cigarettes. Like make sense to me. You know what I mean? Like cigarettes have a way more negative impact on your health than, any red food dye ever will. You know what I mean? So it's like, I look at stuff like that, and being somebody who's a health professional, I've been in the business for 15 years. It's like kind of sad to me that we can't just kind of come together. Like how do you think we can do a better job at bridging that gap to where you have some level of respect for the medical community still while also promoting health and wellness? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, I mean, I have an opinionated view on this. I think the medical community needs to regain the respect. I think the way that we've let family medicine doctors and internists, treat issues like, diabetes and blood pressure and hypertension, just with, and mental health issues, just with drugs is not working. We need to have a very honest conversation about addressing lifestyle problems. Um, and, and so a lot of these chronic diseases, even autoimmune conditions, like you have people, on these like immunomodulating powerful drugs for skin conditions who have never tried to change their diet. I mean, these drugs have so many side effects, um, and so I really like what Bobby is doing, and all of the Maha folks right now, because we're so in the medical take a drug for every ill model right now that I think we need a very powerful voice saying, guys, get good sleep, be physically active, and eat good food. Um, the areas where I think people don't really need to, I mean, this is me personally. I mean, I think, I think surgeries make a lot of sense sometimes, especially emergency surgeries if you're in a wreck. I think things like, this, um, you know, I think back surgery is kind of suspect, but I think knee and hip works really well. And you kind of have to look at all these different areas and see, does this really make sense? So yeah, I struggle with it, Doug. I have to tell you, as someone who has been seen how the sausage is made in his own profession, and just how awful, what the evidence looks like behind the scenes. I really struggle. I feel nervous going to doctors, and I feel like I have to look at everything now. And it's yeah.
Well, I think my thought is that clearly we're in a health crisis in the U.S. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. I also think we have a tendency to overcorrect sometimes when trying to correct something that's wrong, and obviously, and I don't think that's intentional by either side. I think that it's a really sad place to be in where people like are afraid to talk to doctors, and it's also a really sad place to be in where you know people maybe are being prescribed things that shouldn't be prescribed, right? I think that maybe just conversations even like this, or just conversations across the table, instead of like what's happened is there's these silos that are you know created, and you have like movements that just kind of, you got to go back and forth, like one side's trashing the other side's trashing this, and it's like it's not really getting us anywhere, you know what I mean, as far as like the general population. I think we've done a really good job at making health enthusiasts healthier over the last several years. We've done a crap job at the general population because there's so much information out there that people are confused as to what to believe, because there's like this war that exists within people that we're supposed to be kind of trusting. And I love promoting health and lifestyle. I'm not a fan of just trashing the medical community, so to speak, or like you look at like some of the stuff that's being banned. It's like, is that what we should be focusing on, or should we just be focusing on how can we get people to just get more steps in every day? How can we get people to eat more protein, eat more fiber, maybe like teach them how to the basics of strength training, like things that we know that are backed by science that work as far as promoting health and longevity. But I also understand that you know that's it's not as appealing when there's no controversy. You know what I mean?
I think the war. I know war is uncomfortable. I know the conflicting ideas is uncomfortable, but I really think it's a good thing. I mean, we've had a very small group of medical professionals and drug companies controlling the narrative about health for pretty much forever, really. And for the first time in ages, we have a strong government group of people pushing back who actually have backing. And I think these are the conversations that are really helpful, because it's bringing forth people who have different perspectives. And people just need to, I mean, the first step, we don't have great guidelines or any, the war is going on. It's a war on our careers and our reputations. I mean, that's what's happening for the people who are in charge right now. No one's going to step back and saying, oh, by the way, we were wrong for prescribing all of these drugs. We made a terrible mistake. They're not going to say sorry. They're not going to go away. They're just going, their careers will just end eventually when they age out. And so the war is going on right now. In the meantime, I think people just need to hear these conversations and kind of do their own research. And it's worth it, because nothing is more important than your health.
What do you think are some of the like clinical symptoms that someone's actually like depressed or has anxiety? Like, what does their life look like?
Depression and anxiety are just symptoms. And so usually, I mean, what I see happening with people, the way it plays out is they'll have some stressor in their life, like it could be relationships, work, or physical health. They generally feel like quite anxious at first when they're going through it. They deal with huge amounts of anxiety. They feel wired. Their sleep deteriorates, and then they just collapse. And so I usually see anxiety come, and then I see depression follow, and their adrenals are completely burnt out. Maybe they've been using drugs or overusing caffeine or doing anything that they can to just keep on going. They're eating poor food because they're under so much stress, and then they just collapse, and then they just can't go any further. And then, to me, that's how I see anxiety and depression.
And then if you were to kind of like going back to the theme of our conversation, if you could like summarize like a checklist for people to check certain boxes as far as, okay, I want to make sure that I am doing what I can on a daily and weekly basis to make sure my mental state is in the best way it possibly can be. Like, what are if you were to give me like a piece of paper and it had like five things on it, what would they be?
Yeah. Um, Prioritize sleep. So that would be, make sure your room is cool enough. Um, no screens and bright lights before you go to bed. Try and have your last meal at least 3 to 4 hours before you nod off. That will help. After that, clean diet and move every day. So that's like the first one, and then you just have to sit with yourself and you have to say, what's the biggest priority for me right now? Is it my relationships, or is it my purpose and my work? You might decide that, because it's crazy to try and address two massive things at the same time. So you might say, well, I am lonely and I do wish I had a girlfriend, but I actually need to get my life sorted first. I need to figure out a career path for me where I will actually feel energized in the work that I'm doing, and I'll be around people I like. So you put the other thing in a box, you push it away, and then you focus on that one. And then once that one's moving, then you can say, well, is this still my major priority, or is it actually that I need to go and find like a partner that I like and I need to sort this out? And then you kind of shift. Um, so I would do it in that order. I would do health, and then you need to figure out which part needs more attention, and and then reassess. Does this still need the most attention, or can I pivot? I mean, that's a very high level, but the more I've done this, the more I see that it always just seems to boil down into your health, your relationships, and your work.
So at the foundation of this, like, you think people should master their health, their relationships, their work, their sleep, and then the rest will take care of itself.
I do believe that.
Well, Dr. Joseph, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. I loved your insights. I loved the open dialogue and our kind of ability to kind of share different ideas with each other.
Thank you so much for having me.